Parshas Emor will focus on Perek Chaf Gimel, beginning with Pasuk Yud, and we're talking about the mitzvah of the Omer. And the Pasuk says, again, just to reiterate, this is Perek Chaf Gimel, Pasuk Yud, Daber b'nei Yisrael, v'amarta alehem, ki savo el haaretz, asher ani nosein lachem, and then uktsartem es ktsira vavesem es omer, etc. So Rabbi Simcha emphasizes these words, ki savo el haaretz. And whenever we see these words, we know that we're talking about a mitzvah tluya ba'aretz, which is an agricultural mitzvah in Zraim, and depends upon Eretz Yisrael. But what is Eretz Yisrael? For example, one of the main issues that occupies the minds of all the halachic decisors over the generations is the status of Ever HaYarden. And as you recall, Ruvain and Gad and Chatzi Shevet Menashe would win this land, and they would set up their domicile in this land. And then Bnei Yisrael would cross the Yarden and conquer Eretz Yisrael proper. What is the status of Ever HaYarden? Is it Eretz Yisrael or is it not? In our particular context, it becomes halachically relevant with regard to the mitzvah of the Omer. We have to take the Omer from the Sa'ora that grows in Eretz Yisrael. In fact, the Mishnah in Masechta Kelim, when it discusses the Eser Kedushos, the 10 levels of Kedusha, the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, it mentions that Eretz Yisrael, Niskacha Mikol Haratzos, the sanctity, the special unique sanctity of Eretz Yisrael expresses itself in the fact that the Omer is brought exclusively from Eretz Yisrael. You cannot import even the finest barley or sa'ora from, I don't care what country, and bring it as the Karban Omer. And that's based on this pasuk, Ki savo el haaretz. What status does Ever HaYarden have? Now, in order to analyze this, Rabbi Simcha sends us to Parshas Ki Savo. Let's open up for a moment, if you have a chumash, in Dvarim Perek Chaf Vav. And there too, the Torah is addressing mitzvos hatluyos ba'aretz. And Perek Chaf Vav opens with the pasuk, B'haya ki savo el haaretz, and presents in the next pasuk the mitzvah of Bikurim. Bikurim is a classic mitzvah tluya ba'aretz. There's no mitzvah Bikurim outside of the lands of Israel, the land of Israel. And the Torah reiterates this in pasuk Gimel over there in Parshas Ki Savo. Ubasel hakohen asher yeh bayom hahevi amarte lov, he got it to Yayom Lashem Elokecha, ki vasi el haaretz, etc. Ki vasi el haaretz. Now, what we don't have in front of us here is a comment of the Sifri on the words ki vasi el haaretz asher nishba Hashem lavosenu lases lanu. But the Sifri over there in Parshas Ki Savo calls our attention and emphasizes the words lases lanu, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the land. What's the emphasis here on lases lanu? Says the Sifri that, in the name of Reb Shimon, that lases lanu, thank you so much, reflects on those areas after we cross the Yarden, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave into our hands, implying that there are lands within Eretz Yisrael that don't fit the description of Laseis Lanu. And Rabbi Shimon says, Prat, this comes to exclude L'She'ever Ayarden. Why? Says Rabbi Shimon, two words, Shenotlu Me'atzmam. It wasn't necessarily part of the original divine involvement that God would give us this land. 2.5 Shvatim came forward on their own initiative, begging for that land. And there was a haskama, there was an approval, but the initiative still remains in the hands of that sector of Bnei Yisrael. And therefore, Reb Shimon says that the mitzvah of Bikurim does not apply to Ever Yarden. And the reason for that is because Ever Yarden is not described as Laseis Lanu. But Meir Simcha, with an amazing chiddush, wants to take that pasuk over there in Parshas Kisavo in the context of Bikurim and demonstrate that our pasuk here in Parshas Emor, in the context of the Siora that's being brought for the Omer, is word for word identical. Take a look. If you have again Parshas Emor open, it says, "Yamat alem ki savo el haaretz asher ani nosein lachem." Again, the words nosein lachem. And therefore, by virtue of equation, we're going to take Reb Shimon's statement, which appears in the Sifri only there in Parshas Kisov in the context of Bikurim, we're going to apply it here because we have to be consistent in the way we interpret the words of the Torah. So the Torah Shebal Peh now becomes a vehicle to shed a light on Torah Shebechsav. And Haaretz Asher Nasata Lanu refers specifically to the area of Eretz Yisrael proper, crossing the Yarden as Yoshua did, but to the exclusion of the other side of the Yarden. And therefore, Asher Ani Nosein Lachem here in Parshas Omer is telling us that if you go to Evar Yarden and you bring across the Jordan, Eretz Yisrael proper, some barley, that barley is disqualified for the Karban HaOmer. And then he adds the following. Udelo Kirashi. Could you imagine? Rameir Simcha has a brilliant insight with halachic ramifications based on the consistency of interpreting a pasuk in Torah Shebechsav based on Torah Shebal Peh, and he admits that it's against Rashi. Where is this Rashi? Rashi appears in Meshech Nedarim on Daf Chaf Beis Amud Aleph. Now Rashi in Nedarim is a bit, and I'm going to say this in an understatement, is a bit problematic. Again, I'm not going to give you a course in history, but suffice it to say that the manuscripts of Rashi on Masechta Nedarim were lost during the Crusades. We don't know exactly what we have. They printed it on the Vilna Shas on the page as if it were Pirush Rashi. But you and I know that anyone who learns Masechta Nedarim seriously will barely even look and take a glance at Rashi. He'll look straight at the Ran. The Ran writes in Masechta Nedarim on Daf Chaf Beis that Ever Yarden lo niskadsha lahavi mimena omer. For the Meshech Chochma, those words of the Ran are a great victory. What could be more explicit? It's black and white. The Ran is telling you that the Kedusha of Ever Yarden does not generate a status of Omer. and the Omer is disqualified if it's brought from Evar Yarden. Where did the Ran get this from? Says Rabbi Simcha. He got it from the words Loses Lanu, or Asher Ani Nosein Lachem, which means only the other side of the Yarden. And Rashi, who says Meviim HaOmer Me'ever Yarden, that's another sheet. Again, whether it is Shitas Rashi or not, I'm not sure, but I think it's probably Leinzach. I think it's how do I say it would be accurate to say that this is a sheet in the Rishonim, that since the Omer has to be brought from Eretz Yisrael, Evar Yarden is Eretz Yisrael. However, the Ran says against this. Now, you know that one of the greatest Sephardic minds over the last 3 centuries was the Chidah, Reb David Azulai. And he wrote a sefer called the Birkei Yosef. I happen to be a proud owner of the Birkei Yosef. And he writes, Minchas HaOmer, Shahoyu Makrivim Bizman Abayis, Ein Mevi'in Osa Elamei Eretz Yisrael, V'chein Mefurash Barambam, Perek Zayin Hilchas Tminim Musafim, Halacha Gimel, Hine Noho Alti Lachkar, Davar, Imotzi Lasuye Minchas HaOmer, Me'ever HaYarden Olo. The Chidah adds a comment. How do we interpret the Rambam when the Rambam writes that we cannot bring the Omer from anywhere but Eretz Yisrael? I want to raise a Chakira. What is the status of Evar Yarden? Is it part of Eretz Yisrael or is it not? And he brings sources back and forth in this tremendous piece of research of the Chidah from almost 3 centuries ago. And now we have it at our fingertips. The answer is it's a machlokes between Rashi and the Ran. And according to the Meshech Chochma, Rabbi Shimon, quoted in the Sifri in Parshas Bikurim, is a clear-cut proof to support the Shita of the Ran, and Evar Yarden is not sanctified with the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. Ad kan Meshech Chochma. Mikan v'elech Burzon. I want to tell you what's going on over here. You remember that the Zionists would sing Shtei Gidot Layarden Zu Shalonu V'Zu Gam Tek Gam Ken. In truth, they were right. Both sides of the Yarden are ours, but that doesn't mean that both sides of the Yarden were sanctified with Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. There are 2 distinct concepts that should never be confused. One is called Eretz Yisrael, and the other is called Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. And the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael requires a kiddush, an act of sanctification, and we paskin that the act of sanctification is kibush in the first sanctity. That kibush and that sanctity, according to one man Omar, and that's how we accept it, la'alacha, was kidsha l'shaitiv v'lo kidsha l'asid lavo, which means that when the Babylonians exiled us, we lost and forfeited the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. 70 years later, we came back to Eretz Yisrael for the second sanctification. The second sanctification of Ezra and Nehemiah was not a result of kibush. There was no act of battle, of conquering the land, but there was a kiddush. The Rambam identifies that kiddush as chazaka, that we settled in the land and it became ours, and we were able to build the Beis Hamikdash. What is the status of Eretz Yisrael during the 70 years between the first Kiddush, which terminated at the exile, and the second Kiddush? And the answer is, it's Eretz Yisrael. Don't fool yourself. In fact, the status of the land as Eretz Yisrael dates back to Avram Avinu. Kum hisalech ba'aretz. But kum hisalech ba'aretz is what we call a Maisa Kinyan. The Gemara compares it to Chazaka, but it's not a Maisa Kiddush. So we have two different distinct ideas here. Where Emor Simcha is telling us is not that Eivra Yarden is Chutz La'aretz. Heaven forbid to say such a thing. Eivra Yarden is part and parcel of Eretz Yisrael, but it wasn't sanctified. And the land has to be sanctified in order to generate a chiyuv of mitzvos hatluyos ba'aretz, mitzvos hatluyos bekarka. The agricultural mitzvos depend upon kiddush. So if you ask me, was there trumos maisus bikurim during the 70-year period between Churban Bayis Rishon and Binyan Bayis Sheni? The answer is no. There was no truma u'maisa on the doraisa level, because the kiddush of kedusha rishona was gone, and it was premature for the kedusha sheniya. However, the land is still ours. It belongs to us. It has a shem Eretz Yisrael. And I'll give you an example. You may have heard of the Kaftar V'Ferach. His last name was Farchi. He lived approximately, I think, about maybe 4 centuries ago or more. No, more than 4 centuries. And he writes, he's like the expert on Zeraim, and he writes that if a person were to leave Eretz Yisrael and settle, let's say in Aza, down south, which is below the borders of the land of Israel that was conquered by the Ole Bavel at the time of Ezra Nehemiah, he says that would not be an act of Yetziah Me'eretz Yisrael. He's still within the bounds of Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara says in Gittin, if you sell an Eved to Chutz La'aretz, he goes free. The Kafta V'Ferach says if you sell an Eved down south, that's not Chutz La'aretz. If you sell an Eved to Eivra Yarden, that's not Chutz La'aretz. Eivra Yarden is part of Eretz Yisrael. In fact, the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael go even beyond. Is Eretz Chiti and so forth, and the other Shvat that we can't, that we. So Bosai, as we leave this Meshech Chochma, I don't want you to walk away with the wrong impression. The Meshech Chochma does not mean to exclude Eivra Yarden from Eretz Yisrael. What he means is it doesn't have that halachic sanctity of Eretz Yisrael as far as Bikurim, as far as the Omer is concerned. And that's why in the Mishnah in Caleb, when the Mishnah wants to demonstrate that Eretz Yisrael mikudeshes mikol haratzos, it quotes the halach of Omer, because the fact that the Omer cannot be brought from Chutz La'aretz is because Chutz La'aretz doesn't have the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. And the Meshech Chochma is telling us, based on a clear-cut, meticulous reading of our pasuk, that Eivra Yarden was not sanctified as far as the Omer is concerned. But let's go on. Isavo el ha'oretz. We started pasuk Yud, so let's continue. Uktzartem es haktzira, and the Torah goes on to give us the mitzvah of Ktsiras Ha'omer. The Meshech Chochma, at this particular juncture, and I'm not exactly sure I understand why at this particular juncture, but I guess because he spoke about Eretz Yisrael and the specific agricultural mitzvahs that depend upon its sanctity, he takes off on a journey. And he says that the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, which expresses itself in so many different unique mitzvahs, which are agricultural in nature, revealed to us something about the ratzon, the will of God. Ki ratzon Hashem Yisrael, shol yizgashmu b'nei Yisrael. When a person gets involved in farming, he's really at a crossroads. He can turn in one way, he can turn in the other way, in terms of his mental appreciation for farming. He can look at it from a business perspective. Now, I don't know which businesses gained during the last year of this pandemic, but I'm probably convinced that the agricultural people did very well because we needed food. The hotel business didn't do so well. So a person can get very involved in the buying and selling of his produce. Right, Chaim, you live on a yishuv and you work the land and you produce and you have beautiful fruits and vegetables and you've harvested tremendous amount, and you can begin and end right there. In Yiddish, we say orangutan. You're totally obsessed with the financial success of agriculture. And it's a lucrative business. We still haven't, with all the advances in technology, we still haven't been able to replace the need for food. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, through his holy Torah, wanted to find a way in which we would be a little bit holding on to the brakes here in the agricultural sphere and not get carried away with all of the profits, the buying and selling, and those aspects. Therefore, nasan lehem abore mitzvos harbe b'chol poel b'chol mitzad miloshen tzad, on every step of the way. Liyached kol inyonei bnei adam el Hashem Yisparach. How do we take such a physical, material preoccupation and work and rededicate it and guide it in the direction of, for the sake of Hashem? Leos kol apolim hachomriim, all these physical, material involvements. Lidrachim meirim, take it to spiritually enlightened paths. Mazhirim magia bem l'shleimus hamiti. Imagine using farming and agriculture, which is so material and physical. You're down to the earth, and upgrading it to the level of spirituality, of shleimus hamitis, to come to a perfection in your relationship with the Almighty. Liskarvus Lashem Yisparach. And he says, already betchilas haktsira, the first major preoccupation of the farmer to sell his produce is ktsira. Again, there are many, many malachas, as you know, and pulos labor before the ktsira. But when you get to ktsira, that's it. That's the epitome. Now we're going to harvest. Now we're going to package up into gigantic barrels and volumes of produce and sell them on the market. At that point, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you know what? The Reishis Ktsira, the very first initiative of Ktsira, is going to be for the sake of a korban ha'omer. And that's going to be as far as barley is concerned, but the mainstay is wheat. And that's going to be that the first wheat is going to be the Shtei Alechem on Chag HaShavuos. The Oz Yutar Achilas Chadash. Before the Omer is brought, you're not allowed to enjoy the benefit of the produce of your land. And B'sof HaKtsira, now we have another mitzvah. I've harvested the entire field. Can I cut down the very last stalk that's growing in my field? Absolutely not. And that's the mitzvah of Peah. Lo sechala pa'as sodcha, lager v'loni tazavosa. You've got to give the poor people the end of your ktsira. So the first ktsira goes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's in the form of the Omer, and in the case of Chita, in the form of the Shtei Alechem, and the end ktsira, on both ends, that goes to the ani, to the poor person. Ubitoch HaKtsira. Okay, payers at the end. But what about Toch Kidei, as I'm involved in Ktsira? Now we have a mitzvah of Leket. Leket means that what you're able to cut down with your sickle and receive it as it falls into your receptacle, take it away. But that which falls on the ground, that's for the oni. Is therefore the Torah says, lo salakit, don't go back and pick up that which fell on the ground. Rashis, emta, visof, haktsira. There's a mitzvah that's going to attach the beginning, the middle, and the end of the ktsira. Kodesh Hem Lashem. To sanctify and uplift the ktsira, which is such a physical, material preoccupation, as he calls it, polim ha-chomriyim. Ubahem, and through these acts, 1, 2, and 3 of ktsira, yushrash ha-chemla v'ha-chesed. We started with dedicating the Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's the shlemus of his karvus Lashem. Now, what's our relationship to our fellow man? Do we have compassion for the downtrodden, those who are in a lower financial state than we are, the destitute? And that's chemla v'chesed asher hein hein. This is what reflects on the nefesh Yisraeli. Remember, Rabbi Simcha always talks about the unique spirit and soul of the Jewish nation. The Osher Ashlemus Tachlis HaNirtzal HaKadosh Baruch Hu V'lachein Siyam HaParsha B'Kutzrechem Afal Pichek Kvar Nichta B'Parshas Kedoshim. So here Rabbi Simcha wants to answer a question. If we take a look back in Perek Yud Tes, Pasuk Tes, in Parshas Kedoshim, we have a kasha to ask. Okay. Is the following. Ubekutzrechem es ktsir artzachem lo salaket pa'asod cholik tsar v'leket ktsircha lo salaket. In other words, what we have here in our parsha is what seems to be a repetition of what we had in Parshas Kedoshim. I mean, the only difference is that perhaps you could say that Parshas Kedoshim is more explicit, but nevertheless, Rabbi Simcha wants to suggest that Adarabah, because we're bothered by what seems to be the redundancy and the repetition of the word of Bekutzrechem, that's going to teach us that there are two different dimensions of Bekutzrechem. The Bekutzrechem of Parshas Kedoshim is the Chemla and the Chesed of Leket Ketzircha Lo Salaket. And that means that during the process of Ketzira, we dedicate so much for the poor. But our Bekutzrechem, which is here in Parshas Emor, here the Torah is saying that we have to keep in mind at the very beginning of Ketzira that we're doing this l'shem shamayim, it's l'shem Hashem k'dei l'skarev el Hashem. So the two parshios really complement each other. Now here in Perek Chav Gimel, we want to fast forward to Pasuk Yud Gimel, which is very close. And the Torah is talking about this special Karban Mincha, which is called the Minchas HaOmer, brought on the 16th of Nisan. What's unique about this Karban? First of all, it's a Mincha of Siorin, which is pretty rare. And secondly, it's Shnei Esronim, Solus, etc. And if you take a look and every other korban mincha solis, you'll find that the Torah repeats itself over and over. And it's an isara, one isara. Here in the case of the Minchas Omer, it's 2 esronim. And here Meir Simcha quotes the Sifra, the Torah's Kohanim, Hareza Yatza Michlal Hakvasim, every keves that has to be accompanied by a korban mincha is accompanied by one isaron, but here it's a yotze min haklal litein shnei esronim. And this korban ha'omer is going to be accompanied by a mincha soles of siora, shnei esronim. The Rechol Makom, and here Rabbi Simcha wants to see if we can answer some question in the Pshuto Shel Mikra based on this Sifra. And he says the following. B'chol Makom, whenever you see the Torah describing a mincha, it always says soles isaron. The word soles comes first, and then it says isaron. But here, you find the word shnei esronim, and afterwards followed by the word soles. Strange that the Torah here, in this context, changes the sequence, and the word soles appears second. And logically, soles should come first, as it always does, because first tell me the material that has to be brought as a mincha in this korban, and then tell me how much of a volume. You don't start with the volume before you start with the material that has to be brought. So, for example, if you'll talk about a mincha of soles, it'll say soles, and then it'll tell you bring any sorrow. Why did the Torah switch the order around here? It's unbelievable. He's using almost literary license. He's saying when you want to point out to a person, hey, wake up, because it's a little bit different in this case. This is an exception to the rule. Then what you do is you look for one way of emphasizing it. The way that the Torah wanted to sock it home that this is an exception to the rule, and we need shnei esronim, is by putting the volume first and then the substance afterwards. Shnei esronim solis. Very stunning. Now we're going to fast forward by skipping one paragraph, and we're going to read Reb Meir Simcha on Pasuk Tesvav, Usfartem lachem mimochas haShabbos. Now, as you know, there was a major dispute about how to read these words mimochas haShabbos. We'll hopefully get to talk about that a little bit later, but for now, we accept the Prushim, and it means the day after Yontif of Pesach. So we're on the 16th of Nisan. We're already into Pesach, Chag Pesach, and the Torah is commanding us to bring the Korban HaOmer and then to count the days of the Omer. So from the day of Havas HaOmer, we count number 1, and then we count 49 days, and the 50th day is Chag HaShavuot. The Zohar says, very famous, that this counting is part of a preparation for Kabbalah Satorah. Achona leKabbalah Satorah. Why is counting indicative of a preparation? And the Zohar gives the example of a woman who is counting her 7 clean days in order to prepare for intimacy with her husband. Kizava lebaila. Says Reb Meir Simcha, perhaps we can reveal an additional message here in this parsha. We know that the history of Klal Yisrael is mostly, if you take, you count up the years, mostly in chutzlaritz, in Golus. And one might have said the following, we're suffering so much in Golus, we're subjugated by the Umos HaOlam, and maybe our commitment to observe the mitzvos during this long, dark, despairing period of Golus is less than it is when we're in Eretz Yisrael. But he says, Tachlis Kabbalas HaTorah. When we think of how to prepare ourselves to Kabbalas HaTorah, there's one concept that has to penetrate deep into our souls. And that is that the purpose of receiving the Torah is lanetzach. It's eternal. It's not limited in time. There is no time period and no situation in which Klal Yisrael are in any way exempt from their dedication and loyalty to observe the Torah. The great experience of the revelation of Torah at Har Sinai was not meant for a limited amount of time. We would be able to perceive Kaviyachal Hashem Panim El Panim. The Torah is interested in doing this great revelation of giving the Torah for all eternity. We're giving krechzu. You can imagine the city of Dvinsk, of Dagopolsk, in Lita at the time of Rabbi Simcha. My father, Zichron Levracha, came from an area very close to Dagopolsk. And my father used to always say that Jewish blood was hefker. If a Jew was murdered, nobody paid any attention to it. There's less din, less naya. It's my father's childhood. V'nenokim. Nenokim means we are strangled. Umefuzarim. And we're spread out. Umuvloim bena umos. And in a certain sense, we lose our identity. The Jewish people are suffering from such poverty. How many Jews never was swallowed up by the goyim around them? And they thought, if we act like goyim, maybe we could get the jobs and we could get they lost so much during this bitter, long golus. And the Torah is telling us, what Kabbalas HaTorah is? Gam oz yishmeru, wherever we are and whatever situation we find ourselves, we have to be meticulous to observe kol prat, every detail. And the ultimate goal of all the mitzvahs is sheyu nivdolim mehem, that adarabah, when we're mixed up with the goyim and golus, we should be separate ourselves from them. Rabbi Simcha lived at the time when the Zionist movement was taking on a new push, a new inspiration. But many of the Zionists wanted to make the Jewish people a nation like any other nation. They were not religious oriented. They didn't have the Torah. Maybe they would settle in Uganda, I don't know where. But we have the Torah. And the Torah is telling us that we should always be separate from the Goyim. B'halichasam, in the way we behave, b'chol or choseim, v'hakol al pi Torasenu HaKadosha. And therefore the Torah says, the avdil eschem min ha'amim, the experience of receiving the Torah is an experience of separating us from the nations of the world. Says Rabbi Simcha, perhaps this could shed a new light on the Torah's deliberate implementation of the word Shabbos. in this context as a preparation for Kabbalah Sator. Why does this period of time of Sphira, which the Zohar identifies as preparation for Kabbalah, why does it begin with Shabbos, the word which caused such a split between the Tzdukim and the Prushim? Says Rabbi Meir Simcha, the word Shabbos indicates change. It indicates something different. Shvisa, 6 days of the week, and now you have Shabbos, whole different behavior pattern. And yet, the word Shabbos in this context means Pesach. Mimachras Hashabbos. Pesach likewise, says Rabbi Simcha, manifests itself in a separateness from the rest of the year. For 358 days out of the year, we're eating chametz. Those who were with me last night, we had some beautiful breads here from, Berman's Bakery. It was, that was my job, was to cut up the buns. I was overwhelmed by the smell. It was so beautiful. Comes Pesach for 7 days, and we have to separate ourselves from chametz. The Gemara calls chametz an iser which is lo bedile minei inshi. What's unique about chametz in the entire constellation of machalas asuros is that chametz is mutter the whole year round. I eat it, I love it, I put it on my table, I break bread. Comes Pesach, and my entire way of life changes radically. Hopefully the matzahs are good, but it's not the same as eating chametz. You have to admit. Therefore, lo b'dilim b'nei inchi v'cholzos mashbisim also mikol gvulam. The word Shabbos is the shoresh of the same word tashbisu that appears in Parshas Bo with regard to chametz. The Torah is telling you that if you're preparing for Chag HaShavuos, for Kabbalah Satorah, please learn the lesson of tashbisu, of separating yourself, of changing your whole way of life. You're going to go into Golus. The Torah is being given not just for the glorious days of redemption in Eretz Yisrael, it's being given for those difficult periods of time in which we are tempted to be like the Goyim. Horoshi yikablu haTorah yishmeru kasher yu muvloim bein bnei nechar v'yu nivdolim mehem lo b'dilim minei inshi. That same word, lo b'dilim minei, which means we're not separated from chametz. On this day of Tashbisu, we have to separate ourselves. And the chametz, in a certain sense, is a symbol here of the Goyim. We're going to receive the Torah, and the Torah is going to teach us that even when we live amongst the Goyim, it's going to be a Tashbisu. We're going to separate ourselves from b'dilim minei. B'chukoseim lo telechu. We should not be tempted to imitate them. Oh, sorry. Pasuk Mem Beis. 1 second. Let me not skip Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Whoa. Okay, I'm in tension here. Okay, there's too much to do. Yom Kippurim, Perek Chaf Gimel, Pasuk Chaf Aleph, and the Torah says, I got myself a little bit Um, I'm sorry. We're talking about Chag HaShavuos. Rabbi Simcha is going to equate it to Yom Kippur. That's why I got a little bit confused. He says, "Ukrosem bi'etzem hayom hazeh mikra kodesh yelachem kol meleches avoda lo sasu." The Torah commands us to abstain from malacha on Chag HaShavuos. Why does the Torah say, asks Rabbi Simcha, "Ukrosem bi'etzem hayom hazeh"? Well, what's bi'etzem hayom hazeh? Says Rabbi Simcha, we find something similar with regard to Yom Kippurim, and this is going to be later on in Pasuk Lamed Aleph, and he says the following. Sorry. The Torah says, on this very day, right, the Etzem Hayom say, you have to observe the holiday of Shavuos and Losasu, Komlechas Avoda Losas. With regard to Yom Kippurim, the Torah says, Kol nefesh asher lo seuna bi'etzem hayom hazeh v'nichrasa. So the phrase bi'etzem hayom hazeh appears in the context of Yom Kippurim as well. Nere de bolamai tosefes yontiv mi iser malacha. K'mod darshinon gabe Yom Kippurim lemai tosefes inui mikares. Rabbi Simcha refers to a sugya in Meshech Yuma on Daf Chaf Aleph, and the Gemara wants to know what's the status of someone who does malacha during Tosefes Yom Kippur, when he accepts Yom Kippur early. And from the fact that it says Bi'etzem Hayom Hazeh, the Torah says Bi'itzumo Shel Yom Onush Kares, Bi'eno Onush Kares as Tosefes Malacha. If he does malacha during Tosefes, he's not chayav kares. What about Tosefes inui? Let's say, for example, he's makabel Yom Kippurim, then he eats or he drinks. And the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar, ki kol nefesh asher lo seuna bi'etzem hayom hazeh v'nichrasa. So twice in the context of Yom Kippurim, the Torah employs the words bi'etzem hayom hazeh. First with regard to malacha, second with regard to inui, achil and shsia, and in both cases, the bi'etzem hayom hazeh tells me mafuki to exclude Tosefes, that if he does malacha or he eats or he drinks in Tosefes Yom Kippurim, he's not chayav karetz. The Rambam, when he codifies this in Shvisas Osor, he writes, Kishem she Shvus malacha bo, on this day of Yom Kippur, you abstain for malacha bein b'yom bein b'layla, kach Shvus le'inui bein b'yom bein layla. V'tzarech lahosif michol ala kodesh b'knisaso u'b'yitziaso. And it means that you begin to fast on the 9th in the evening. And Shenemar, the Rambam quotes the pasuk me erev had erev tishbu Shabbos. The Rambam says that we have a Gzeres HaKosuv, both with regard to entering into Yom HaKippurim and with regard to Yitzia Yom HaKippurim, that we begin a little earlier and abstain from eating, and we extend it a little later. Writes the Maggid Mishnah, Midivrei Rabbeinu nireh she'ein tosefes, the status of tosefes when you add to Yontif, eino dvar Torah ela bi'inui. The Rambam only in the case of inui, because the extra pasuk of me'erev ad erev tishbesu derives tosefes. Avolo be'inyan asiyas melacha. He says, as far as the asiyas melacha is concerned, tosefes is not a biblical enterprise. It's only derabana. So Meir Simcha says, "V'zeu l'shitas Rabbeinu Moshe the iser melacha the tosefes Shabbos and Yontif havirak midivrei sofrim." And how do we know that that applies to another Yontif? There's Meir Simcha. Here in the Yontif of Shavuos, the Torah adds the words "Bi'etzem hayom hazeh" to tell me that Tosefes Yontif is not Doraisa. Why then, asks Rabbi Meir Simcha, of all places, did the Torah decide, dafka with regard to Shavuos, to add these words Bi'etzem hayom hazeh, to tell you that Tosefes Yontif is not Aser, it's only Bi'etzem hayom hazeh lafuki Tosefes. Why dafka here in Chag HaShavuot? So Meir Simcha, of course we're running out of time, I'm not going to read it inside, he presents the following thesis. According to the Tzdukim, Mimachras HaShabbos means Shabbos Shel Breishis, which means by definition that we begin to count the Omer on the day after Shabbos. It's always going to be on a Sunday that we begin the period of the Omer. And therefore, he says, if you fast forward 50 days, then Shavuos is going to fall on a Sunday, according to the Tzdukim. Every Shavuos is on a Sunday. Now, if every Shavuos is on a Sunday, then Tosefes Shavuos is Doraisa. What does that mean? That yesterday, Erev Shavuos was on Shabbos. And therefore the Torah prohibits Malacha on Shabbos. Therefore, what the Torah wanted to tell me by adding Be'etzem hayom hazeh is to tell me that on Erev Shavuos, Malacha is D'Rabbanan. Why? Because we don't accept the Tzdukim that Mimachras HaShabbos means on a Sunday, and therefore Shavuos could fall out on any day of the week according to our interpretation of Prusha. If that be the case, the Torah went out of its way to say, well, if Shavuos is on a Tuesday, and on Monday in the evening, right before sunset, you accept upon yourself Tosefes Shavuos, you're allowed to do Malacha. That limud could not be meaningful according to the Tzdukim. You could never, ever have, according to the Tzdukim, a situation in which Tosefes Yontif is only the Rabbanon, because Tosefes Yontif will always, by definition, overlap with Shabbos. And now we fast forward to Pasuk Mem Beis, and we have about 6 minutes. Let's see what we can do. The Torah commands us to sit in the sukkah. Says Rameir Simcha, we can divide up all of the mitzvos of the Torah into two categories. One is mitzvos kefi hateva. These are mitzvos which would somehow reflect themselves in the natural way that man behaves. There is another category of mitzvahs in which the mitzvah obligates us to behave in a very unnatural way. He says that sukkah is a paradigmic case of neged hateva. Why is it neged hateva? The man has worked and slaved during this entire period of time. In the summer, after he did Charisha and Zriya and Idur and Ktsira and Omer, Ma'amer, Amel Besada. He has now gathered in all the produce. Chaga Asif is around the corner, and everything is stored in silence. He's very happy. What would be the natural way of celebrating his happiness? Mametukalo menuchaso listofef bitzel beis. Baruch Hashem, he has a beautiful house. Take it easy. Now's the time to celebrate. Take out a bottle of good vintage wine and take life easy. Bas HaTorah v'omer tzei midiras hakva v'shev b'diras haroi. Go out and sit in this little hut. It's getting a little chilly. One of my friends in Canada told me that she has never sat in the sukkah in Canada. Let her husband go into the sukkah. I'm not going in. It's too cold. The purpose of the Torah is l'kadesh, to sanctify kochos adam hagoshosav migvul achomri, to take man out of his natural comfort zone, his physical comfort. Therefore, the Torah says, Chag HaSukkos, Asa Lashem, Lashem, Shem Shamayim Chal HaSukkah. This is a sugya, Meshech the Sukkah Daf Tes, that Shem Shamayim Chal HaSukkah. It's all a Shem Shamayim. It's not natural. However, Yesh Mitzvot Shehem Kfi Chuket. They reflect and express almost the natural psychological behavior of man. But the Torah gives you details. With the Chochma, the divine, infinite wisdom of God, God tells you exactly how to fulfill this mitzvah, but the mitzvah is really an expression of your natural feelings and behaviors. And the Gemara says in Bab Metzia, with regard to the Isser of eating creeping creatures like shrotzim, Mila, I give you a Mila. In other words, I'm elevating you. Okay, naturally, you might find this absolutely repulsive, but I'm going to give you a Mila. I'm going to tell you new laws and minutia. He says, Michok HaTeva, what's the natural way of celebrating this moment of simcha, of asif? He's gathered in his zaronim ataros shel shibolim. The minhag amongst the nations of the world was to go out and take various specimens of the vegetation of the growth, the most beautiful fruits, and celebrate it. And the Torah says, that's exactly what I want you to do. I'm only going to limit it to 4 species, the Daled Minim, and usmachem l'fnei Hashem shivas yomim. You will be besimcha, waving your produce, your beautiful produce, during the 7 days. And therefore, says Rameir Simcha, with regard to the Esrog, it doesn't say the word Lashem. Nowhere do we find that Shem Hashem Nikra ala Esrog. He says the following, that with regard to an Esrog, The law is that, what does he say here? Just 1 second. Oh, let's go back to Sukkah, where Sukkah it says Tasel Hashem, and that's a mitzvah neged ateva. Therefore, the Sukkah has to be set up l'shem Hashem, according to Beit Shammai. A Sukkah Yishon is Psula. And then the Torah says, Tasev lo min ha'asur. So the great demands and meticulous laws in setting up this Sukkah. Lo kain b'daled minin. Heim kifi teva. They reflect the Teva. Eino tzarech hachana rabba. We don't have all these minutiae and specific limitations and regulations that govern the Daled Minim. The Afsheno Agud Kosher, the law is that he takes the 4 Minim and they're not tied and bound together. He was Yotzei B'di'evet. Lekasiya Gabe, we're not involved in building the 4 Minim, they're in nature, not like the Sukkah, which we have to construct. The law of Tasev V'lo Asui doesn't apply to the Daled Minim. Liked Anofim B'Yontif Kosher. With regard to the Sukkah is Asur Ba'ana Kol Shiva. You're not allowed to benefit at all from the Sukkah. In the case of the Daled Minim, there's a halacha called Hukso L'Mitzvaso. And let's say, for example, if you have Hadassim, and the derech is that you normally would smell the Hadassim, also la riachbo, but the Gemara says that Esrog shall mitzvah mutar la riachbo. My time Hadas, the Gemara says, this is a sugya in Sukkah Daf Lamed Zayin, Hadas de l'reicha koi, ki akse mereicha akse. When you designate this Hadas for a mitzvah, then you are saying, I will not smell it and enjoy its fragrance. But Esrog de l'achila koi, ki akse me'achila akse. So you would not be allowed to eat the esrog, but you're allowed to smell the esrog and enjoy its pleasant fragrance. Again, I'm not paskening. I mean, that's the Gemara. But in any event, you see clearly that the halach of Shem Hashem Nikrolov does not apply to an esrog as it applies to a sukkah. A sukkah, you're not allowed to benefit in any shape or form from the schach. Not so in the case of an esrog. An esrog is a mitzvah that reflects the teva, whereas sukkah is a mitzvah that reflects kineged teva. And the kineged teva means dedicated 100% to Lashem, Shem Hashem Nikra Sukkah. It's going to be Tasev V'lo Min Asui, all the details of schach, and these are not from the schach. And this is all because, why are you leaving your pleasant home, your diras keva? Torah says, go out into a diras haroy, dafka, at that period of time, at that moment when you'd rather be in a diras keva. L'kadesh kochos ha'odem ha'gershosav migvul ha'chomri, to take you out of your physical, natural state of being and uplift you into a state of Lashem, and therefore Lashem is chal on the sukkah. Now I know for some of us this is very difficult because we enjoy our sukkah tremendously. It's really very pleasant, and in contemporary life we've successfully constructed the most beautiful sukkahs, and we take out everything into the sukkah, and we have a view of Yerushalayim from our sukkah, and who knows what. But sukkah is still meant to take us out of that state of comfort of natural diras keva into a state of diras arov. So just to summarize very quickly, what we learned today is what's the status of Eivra Yarden. Rabbi Simcha sees in the pasuk here, Ani nosei lachem, with regard to the Omer cannot come from Eivra Yarden. In the case of the mincha that's brought on the day of the Omer, the Torah switches the order, Shnei Esronim Soles, to emphasize that here's the exception to the rule, and we need twice the volume of Soles that normally we would use. We discussed the fact that Sfiras HaOmer is a period of preparation, according to the Zohar, for Kabbalas HaTorah, and the Torah used the word B'mochas HaShabbos. Shabbos represents our change in the behavior pattern. It means that we should be muvdal on this day. Shabbos refers to Pesach. On Pesach, the Torah says, Tashbisu, get rid of your chametz, even though you're low b'dilimine, you're used to it, now separate yourself. And the message is that the Torah is being given for all times, even when in bitter golus, and we have to reflect a unique behavior and separate ourselves from the goyim instead of imitating them. Why does the Torah dafka in Shavuos with regard to Isur Malacha add the words B'etzem Hayom Hazeh? We saw that in Yom Kippur we derive from B'etzem Hayom Hazeh. The Rambam Shita is that Tosefes is only D'Rabbanan. How do we know that that applies even to Tosefes Regolim, Shlosh Regolim, from B'etzem Hayom Hazeh? Why did the Torah say it here? Dafka in the context of Shavuos to exclude the Stukim. And finally, last but not least, the categorization of two paradigmic mitzvahs, Sukkah and Daled Minim. Sukkah is Keneged HaTeva, Daled Minim is a reflection of the Teva, and that is going to express itself in halachic differences between the Sukkah and the Daled Minim. And with this, I bid you a great Shabbos Parshas Emor, and the Mirz Hashem, we should hear better news, and all our limud and our tfilos on behalf of those who are very seriously injured. They woke up my son in the middle of the night to fly him down. He's in a special unit in the army. And we really need a siyata d'shmaya. Our limud should be also as chus up in Shamayim for fush labor. Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.
And a happy Lag Bomer. Not such a happy Lag Bomer, but